Welcome to the deep dive. We all experience it. That feeling of frustration when we hit a roadblock when we're learning something new. But what if I told you those moments of failure, those times we feel stuck, could actually be beneficial for our brains? Today we're diving into the fascinating world of neuroscience and educational psychology to understand just how our brains benefit from messing up, and perhaps more importantly, how we can manage those negative feelings of failure so we can optimize our learning.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of counterintuitive, right? We naturally want to avoid mistakes, but but the research suggests those moments of failure, those times when we feel like we're not getting it, can actually prime our brains for more effective learning in the long run, and that's really what we're going to explore today.
I love it. Okay, so for this deep dive, we've got a whole bunch of research that's going to help us understand how our brains react in those immediate moments after we face a challenge. When we don't immediately know the answer or when we're learning slower than we'd like. Specifically, we're talking about the neurochemical shifts that happen within the first 90 minutes or so of these experiences.
And while a lot of the research we're going to discuss focuses on college students, that's a period where the brain is still really adaptable. A lot of these principles can apply to learning at any age.
Okay, awesome. So we're going to try and make this as relevant to everyone as possible. Our goal for this deep dive is kind of twofold. First, we want to understand how encountering these learning challenges, how actually experiencing failure can prime our brains to learn more effectively in the long run. And then second, we'll explore some practical strategies you can use to really navigate the less enjoyable aspects of failure. Because let's be honest, it doesn't always feel good. But if we can figure out how to manage those negative feelings, we can really get the most out of our learning efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to be digging into some really specific tools and techniques that you can start applying in your own life right away.
I love it. Okay, let's start with something that you've probably heard of before, neuroplasticity. Now, neuroplasticity is basically the brain's incredible ability to learn and adapt throughout our lives. It does this by forming new connections between brain cells, called neurons, or strengthening the connections that already exist.
Right. And it's this constant process of change that allows us to learn new things, form new memories, and adapt to new situations.
So it's always happening.
It is, yeah. And it's interesting because there are different ways that neuroplasticity happens. When babies are learning, a lot of it is through what we call passive neuroplasticity. So it's more automatic, without a ton of focused effort. But this type of brain adaptability, it tends to decrease as we get older, and it kind of levels off by around age 25.
Right, so babies are like sponges.
Right.
They're just soaking everything up. It makes sense that as we get older, it takes a little bit more effort.
Yeah, and that's where active neuroplasticity comes into play, especially for us as adults. So this is the kind of brain change that requires us to really engage mentally in order to learn and adapt. It takes more deliberate effort.
So we got to put in the work.
Exactly.
Okay. And our sources highlight a key neurochemical that seems to play a really important role in kicking off this active neuroplasticity, and that's epinephrine.
Right. Epinephrine is often associated with the fight or flight response, that surge of energy we get when we're in a stressful situation.
That makes sense.
But it also seems to play a significant role in learning and memory.
So how does that work?
Well, there's some really fascinating research by Cahill and McGaw back in the 1990s that shed some light on this.
Okay.
They discovered that epinephrine actually enhances memory formation. And it does this by boosting activity in the amygdala, that part of the brain associated with emotions, especially fear. Now, this increased activity in the amygdala stimulates cholinergic neurons, which are really crucial for laying down new memories.
Interesting. So it's almost like epinephrine tags those experiences as really important. Hey, pay attention to this.
Exactly. And what's really telling is that the researchers found that if they blocked epinephrine from binding to its receptors in the amygdala, that boost in learning and memory didn't happen.
Wow. Okay, so that suggests a pretty direct link.
Right. It suggests that epinephrine is really key in helping us remember things when we're facing a challenge.
Okay, so that brings us back to our initial idea that experiencing failure can actually be a really powerful trigger for learning, right? You encounter a problem, you don't immediately know the answer, you might feel a little bit of stress or uncertainty, and that could be the epinephrine telling your brain, hey, pay attention, this is important.
That's exactly it. And this concept is actually explored in a really interesting instructional approach called productive failure.
Productive failure. I like that.
Yeah.
So it's not just about making random mistakes. It's like a deliberate strategy. right?
It is. It's a very deliberate teaching strategy where students actively try to solve a problem before they receive any direct instruction on how to do it.
Okay, I see.
And the idea is to let them grapple with the challenge for a certain period, typically around 30 to 45 minutes.
Okay.
So, think about it this way. Think about a time you struggled with a puzzle before someone showed you the solution. That initial effort, even if you didn't solve it, probably made the solution much clearer and more memorable when you finally saw it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like, oh, I was so close.
Exactly.
I get it now. Okay. 30 to 45 minutes of really wrestling with the problem before getting any guidance. That might sound a little frustrating in the moment. Like, why am I doing this?
It can be. It can definitely be challenging, but the research actually supports this approach.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is basically a study that looks at the results of many other studies on a particular topic. And this meta-analysis showed a significant positive effect of this productive failure before instruction method compared to the traditional way of teaching, where you're taught how to do something and then you practice.
Okay.
That initial struggle, even if you don't arrive at the correct answer, seems to prepare your brain to better absorb and understand the right way to do it when it's eventually presented.
Interesting. So it's like, okay,
Yeah,
I tried this and this didn't work. Now show me how it's really done.
exactly. Yeah.
Our sources talked about something called Kapoor's 4As to kind of explain why this initial struggle is so effective. Can you break those down for us?
Yeah. So Kapoor, he suggests that productive failure works through these four interconnected processes.
Okay.
So the first is activation of prior knowledge. When you're confronted with a new problem, your mind naturally starts searching for anything you already know that might be relevant.
Makes sense.
The second A is awareness of a knowledge gap.
Okay.
As you try to tackle the challenge, you start to realize what you don't know, where your current understanding falls short.
Right.
The third is affect. This refers to the feeling of failing itself, that moment of, oh, this isn't working.
Right.
And that's likely where that release of epinephrine that we talked about comes in, making the experience more salient, more memorable for your brain. And finally, assembly,
Okay.
which is the process of piecing together both your incorrect attempts and the eventual correct solution. So by comparing what you tried with what actually works, you gain a deeper understanding.
I see. So it's really that combination of all those things that make it so much more effective than just being told, here's how you do it.
Right.
Right.
It's active, it's engaging, and it involves this emotional component.
That affect piece is really interesting to me. It suggests that the personal experience of struggling and failing is more impactful for learning than just seeing someone else fail.
Right.
Like if you watch someone else make a mistake, you might not learn as much as if you made that mistake yourself.
Yeah, and the research does actually indicate that personal failure tends to be a more potent catalyst for learning than just observing someone else make mistakes. And this might be because when you personally struggle, you have this feeling of, this isn't right. You trigger this stronger neurochemical response, you get that release of epinephrine, and that activates these memory processes.
So it's like your brain pays more attention when you're the one who is experiencing the challenge.
Exactly. It's like, this is important to me. I need to remember this.
Now, we've been talking about epinephrine, but our sources also mention norepinephrine. Are these basically the same thing for our purposes, or is there a difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. They're very closely related.
Okay.
Norepinephrine and epinephrine both belong to the body's stress response system,
Right.
and both of them contribute to increasing alertness, which influences attention and memory. So for the most part, in the context of learning, they act in very similar ways.
Okay.
And that's why the research often just lumps them together as norepinephrine.
Okay.
But it's worth noting that a really big surge of norepinephrine like in a really high stress or dangerous situation can trigger that fight, flight, or freeze response.
Right.
And when that happens, your focus narrows dramatically to just immediate survival. And that's not really ideal for thoughtful learning.
Right. You're just trying to get out of that situation. You're not really thinking about learning algebra.
Exactly. You're not absorbing new information. You're just trying to stay safe.
Right. So what's more beneficial for learning?
So what seems to be more beneficial are these lower, more consistent levels of norepinephrine that you get during sustained attention.
Okay.
When you're, grappling with a challenging problem, but you're not completely overwhelmed by by stress or fear.
Okay.
And this creates a state of what's often called calm alertness.
Calm alertness. That sounds nice.
Yeah, it's like you're focused and engaged, but you're not freaking out. You're not overwhelmed.
Right. That makes sense. That sounds like the ideal state to be in when you're trying to learn something challenging.
It really is. And that's why it's so important to manage your stress levels. And we'll talk about some specific strategies for that later on. But just to kind of give you the big picture, it seems that this state of calm alertness is really the sweet spot for learning.
So is there like a limit to how long we can stay in that state?
There might be. Our sources mention something about a 90-minute window. And this is really important for you to keep in mind in your own learning. After around 90 minutes of sustained focus or dealing with uncertainty, you're maybe making mistakes, your body's ability to maintain that optimal level of norepinephrine starts to decline.
Okay.
And this can lead to your attention wandering, and your learning efficiency just drops off.
So it's like our brain has a natural point where it's like, okay, I've been in this like high alert problem solving mode for a while. I need a break.
Exactly. And there's research to support this. There's research going back to the 1980s, and more recently a brain imaging study with PhD students that really supports this idea of diminishing returns after about 90 minutes of concentrated effort. And they even found that if norepinephrine levels become too high, it can trigger this defensive mechanism in the brain that makes you just want to give up and avoid the challenging task altogether.
Right. So it's like a self-preservation mechanism almost. Like, okay, this is too much. I'm out of here.
Exactly. It's like your brain is trying to protect you from burnout.
Right. But
Yeah.
but our tolerance for this norepinephrine and therefore our ability to kind of push through those initial feelings of failure and uncertainty isn't set in stone, right? It can vary quite a bit from person to person.
It can. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Some individuals naturally have a higher threshold for that feeling of alertness, and they might even seek out challenging or stressful situations.
Yeah.
They thrive on that kind of edge.
Okay.
But the good news is that your tolerance for this kind of cognitive stress can actually be increased through a process called habituation.
Habituation.
Habituation, yeah. And this involves repeatedly exposing yourself to situations that are challenging but ultimately safe, and learning to disconnect that feeling of stress from actual danger or threat.
Okay. I see.
So think of it like getting used to the feeling of exercising hard. The first few times you go for a run or you lift weights, it might feel really uncomfortable.
Right.
But over time your body adapts and it becomes less so.
Right.
And that's habituation.
Okay.
And the same thing can happen with cognitive stress.
So the more we expose ourselves to those challenging situations, the better we get at handling them.
Exactly. And this is really where, the idea of productive failure comes back in, because by engaging in those initial struggles, those periods of grappling with difficult problems, you're actually building your mental resilience.
Okay. And that reminds me of that paratrooper study that we mentioned in our sources. I thought that was a really powerful example of this habituation in action.
It is. It's a classic study. Researchers observed that on the very first day of parachute training, the paratroopers experienced this huge spike in norepinephrine levels. But within just a week of performing daily jumps, their levels had returned to almost their baseline, even right before a jump.
What?
So their brains had rapidly adapted to the experience, essentially learning that while it was stressful, it wasn't actually life-threatening.
It's amazing how quickly the brain can adapt.
Yeah.
Okay. So knowing how norepinephrine affects our learning and our ability to handle failure, what are some practical things we can do ourselves to try and optimize those levels? Our sources talk about some behavioral tools, specifically breathing techniques.
Yeah, that's right. And breathing is really powerful because it's something that we can control consciously, even though it's also happening automatically.
Right. We don't really think about it, but we can.
Exactly. And there are these really simple breathing techniques that you can use to influence your level of alertness.
Okay. Like what?
So if you're feeling overwhelmed or overly stressed, maybe after encountering a really frustrating problem, exhale dominant breathing can be really helpful in calming things down.
Exhale dominant breathing.
Okay. And that just involves taking a deep breath in gently through your nose for a few seconds and then exhaling slowly and for a longer duration. And the reason why this works is because our heart rate naturally tends to speed up a little when we inhale and slow down when we exhale. And that's partly due to changes in pressure in our abdomen. So by consciously extending your exhale, you're basically signaling to your body to slow down your heart rate and reduce that internal feeling of stress and alertness.
So it's like a little trick to kind of hack your nervous system.
Exactly. It's a gentle way to nudge your body towards a more relaxed state.
Okay. So long exhales when you're feeling overwhelmed. What about those times when you're feeling a little bit sluggish or mentally foggy, like maybe when you're first starting to work on something challenging?
Yeah. In those situations, inhale dominant breathing can be a useful tool. And that involves taking a deep breath in through your nose and then quickly exhaling through your mouth.
Okay.
And repeating this for about 30 seconds can help to stimulate the release of norepinephrine and increase your level of alertness and readiness to focus.
Interesting. So you're kind of doing the opposite. You're emphasizing the inhale?
Exactly. You're getting more oxygen into your system and activating that alert state.
Okay. I'm going to try that one tomorrow morning. Okay, so those are some pretty accessible and easy to implement tools.
They are.
How can educators or even individuals designing their own learning use this knowledge to better support learning?
Well, there are several ways. For example, instructors can tell students that feeling a bit stressed or uncertain when they're tackling new challenging material is normal.
Okay.
It's a normal biological response. And in fact, it can even be a sign that their brain is in a state where it's more receptive to learning.
Interesting.
So just reframing that feeling might help students feel less discouraged and reduce the urge to give up when things get tough.
Right, right. It's like, okay, I'm supposed to feel this way. It means my brain is working.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a sign that you're engaged. And educators could also consider incorporating self-assessment into assignments, prompting students to reflect on their own stress levels and how long they've been working continuously on a task.
Right.
And of course, recommending these simple breathing techniques and encouraging regular short breaks during long study sessions or classes could be really beneficial.
Okay. It seems like there's a lot of potential in these simple techniques. But our sources also pointed out that more research is needed, especially in educational settings, to really understand how effective they are. What kind of things could researchers look at?
Yeah. Well, they could look at things like students' grades on assignments, course completion rates, and they could also use more subjective measures, like where students report on their levels of stress and anxiety.
Okay.
And they could even incorporate more objective, non-invasive biometric measures like tracking heart rate variability, even electrodermal activity,
Okay.
which measures changes in skin conductance related to arousal to get a more direct understanding of the physiological changes that are happening when students use these techniques.
Right, right. So we can actually see what's happening in the body.
Exactly.
Okay. Interesting. So far we've been talking a lot about alertness and that kind of high alert state and managing stress.
Right.
But our sources also introduce another really important neurochemical that's deeply involved in learning,
Yeah.
and that's acetylcholine.
Right.
What's acetylcholine's role?
Acetylcholine is crucial for focus and forming new memories.
Okay.
It's kind of like a gatekeeper for learning, particularly when it comes to recognizing and understanding patterns and how your existing knowledge relates to new information. It helps your brain differentiate between what's familiar and what's new and important to remember.
So how does experiencing failure or encountering surprising information tie into the release of acetylcholine?
So what's interesting is that when we encounter surprising outcomes, like if something happens that we didn't expect, or when we learn something new that doesn't fit with what we already believe there's a surge of acetylcholine in the brain.
Okay.
And this acts as a signal to the hippocampus, which is a key brain region for memory formation.
Okay.
It tells the hippocampus to really encode these new experiences by highlighting how they differ from our prior memories.
I see. So it's like your brain is saying, wait a minute, this isn't what I expected.
Right.
I need to pay attention and remember this.
Exactly. And conversely, when things are predictable and unsurprising, acetylcholine release tends to be low, and your brain is more likely to just retrieve existing memories to explain what's happening.
Okay, so acetylcholine is kind of like this is new and important, pay attention signal,
That's a great way to put it.
while norepinephrine is like that more general alertness signal.
Right. And these two systems, they work together, but they're distinct.
Okay. So it sounds like attention, which we've been talking about as being largely driven by norepinephrine and focus, which you're describing as being more reliant on acetylcholine, are actually separate processes.
They are. They're related, but they're distinct.
Okay.
And attention, that initial state of alertness, typically precedes focus.
Okay.
You need to be alert before you can really concentrate.
Right.
And that's why there can often be this brief period, maybe 5 to 10 minutes at the very beginning of a task where it feels difficult to really get into that deep state of focus.
Okay.
You might find yourself suddenly wanting to check your email or tidy your desk when you first sit down to work on something important.
Right. Or like get a snack.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That might be that initial alertness without the directed acetylcholine activity yet kicking in.
Okay. I see.
And similarly, when you experience failure or uncertainty, that initial norepinephrine surge happens first. And it takes a little time and effort for your brain to then settle into that focused state.
So what can we do to help our brains get to that focused state more quickly?
Well, our sources mention something called a visual focus cue.
Okay.
And this is a really simple technique where you direct your visual attention to a single non-moving point. It could be like the tip of your pen or a small dot on a page. And you just hold that focus for 30 to 60 seconds.
Okay.
And the idea is that by controlling your visual attention, you can help to stimulate the release of acetylcholine, and that can make it easier to then shift your focus to the learning task at hand.
Okay.
But it's important to note that this hasn't been extensively studied, so, more research is definitely needed.
So something to try out, but maybe take it with a grain of salt until there's more research.
Exactly.
Okay. How might educators or individuals learning on their own apply this knowledge about acetylcholine and focus in their learning?
Well, educators could experiment with suggesting this visual focus cue to students,
Yeah.
As a way to start a class or when they're starting a homework assignment.
Okay.
And it's also important for instructors to be aware of that initial period it takes for students to really settle into a focused state.
Right.
Starting a class with really complex content in the very first minute might mean that some students miss key foundational information, and then they feel like they're already behind.
Right.
Which can be discouraging.
Absolutely.
So maybe starting with more administrative tasks, a brief review, or even a short, non-content related engaging activity could give students that time to transition into that focused state.
Right. It's like giving their brains a chance to warm up a little bit.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. And what kind of research could be done to see how effective those kinds of interventions are?
Well, they could look at how long students are able to stay on task,
Okay.
when they're working on assignments.
Mm-hmm.
They could use self-report measures that try to capture that feeling of flow, that state of being completely absorbed and focused on an activity.
Okay.
And they could even look at pupil dilation, which can be measured with eye tracking technology.
Oh, wow.
And pupil dilation is interesting because it's an indicator of focus,
Okay.
but it's also related to levels of norepinephrine and activity in the brain's salience network, which is the network that helps us determine what's important to pay attention to.
Right.
So tracking pupil dilation could offer a really interesting way to assess changes in attentional states.
So we can literally see how focused someone is by looking at their pupils.
To some extent, yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So far we've explored how encountering failure can actually be good for our brains. It boosts neuroplasticity through that release of norepinephrine and how acetylcholine is essential for focus. But we also have to acknowledge that failure can be, well, it can be frustrating.
It can. It's not always fun. And our sources make it really clear that while failure can be beneficial for learning, it's not without its potential downsides.
Okay.
Particularly in terms of how it makes us feel.
Right. So how do we kind of reconcile that tension between the benefits and the negative feelings?
Yeah. Well, the key seems to be that if learners can manage to push past that initial wave of negative emotion, that frustration or disappointment and continue to engage with the learning process, their rate of learning can actually increase.
Okay.
However, if that frustration becomes too overwhelming and it leads to them just giving up and disengaging, then they experience all the negative emotions associated with failure without actually getting those positive learning benefits.
Right. It's like getting all the bad with none of the good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's finding that balance. It's about acknowledging those negative emotions but not letting them control you.
Right. So how do we do that? How do we find that balance?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in our next segment. We're going to delve into how failure can impact our motivation to keep learning and our overall tolerance for future challenges.
So we're gonna talk about the emotional side of things and how to manage that.
Exactly.
Awesome. I am here for that.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about how our brains actually benefit from failure, and now we're going to shift our focus to how failure affects our motivation to learn.
Yeah, and motivation is huge, right? It's what keeps us going when things get tough.
Absolutely. And our sources highlight that while failure can, kick off all these helpful neurochemical responses, as humans, we're also naturally inclined to avoid it. We don't like to fail.
Right. No one enjoys that feeling of not being good enough or of falling short.
Exactly. So how does failure actually impact our motivation?
Well, it really depends on how we mentally interpret it. If we view failures as valuable learning opportunities, as necessary steps on the path to mastery, then we tend to persevere.
Okay.
But if we see them as evidence of our inadequacy or as these insurmountable setbacks,
Yeah.
it can be really demotivating.
Right. It's like that voice in our head that says, "See, I told you couldn't do it."
Exactly. Yeah, and that's where that negative self-talk can really sabotage us.
Right. So our mindset really matters.
Absolutely. Our mindset is crucial.
And speaking of mindset, our sources talk about dopamine and its role in motivation. And I think a lot of people associate dopamine with pleasure, like when you eat a piece of cake or something.
Yeah, dopamine is often called the pleasure chemical.
Right. But our sources suggest it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Right. It is, yeah. While dopamine does play a role in the feeling of satisfaction and pleasure that we experience after achieving something we value, its primary function in motivation is actually about driving us to seek out and pursue those things in the first place.
Okay, so it's not just about the pleasure of the reward. It's about the anticipation.
Exactly. It's about the anticipation of the reward. And we all have this baseline level of dopamine that's essential for just basic movement and cognitive function.
Okay.
But when we anticipate something that we deem valuable, whether it's a good grade or mastering a new skill, our dopamine levels increase.
Okay.
And this increase creates that internal drive, that feeling of wanting to overcome challenges and reach our goals.
Just like the wanting, the striving that's really fueled by dopamine.
Exactly, yeah. And it's also interesting to note that dopamine acts as a precursor to the norepinephrine, which further stimulates our mental and physical activity, helping us to take action.
Okay, so it's all connected. It's like a cascade of neurochemicals.
It is. It's a beautiful symphony of brain chemistry.
I love it. Okay, so we've got this anticipation that's driving the dopamine.
Yeah.
What about when we actually achieve the goal?
So when we finally achieve something we've been working towards, like getting a good grade on a tough assignment or completing a challenging project, we do get a surge of dopamine.
Okay.
And that reinforces the actions we took to get there.
Okay.
But there's a potential downside here. After that initial dopamine surge, levels tend to dip back down, sometimes even below our baseline.
Okay.
And depending on how big that initial surge was, the subsequent dip can range from, a relatively neutral feeling to something that feels quite uncomfortable and even demotivating.
So it's like you're on this high and then you come crashing down.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why people sometimes experience this letdown or even feel a bit down after a big achievement.
Right. It's like, okay, now what?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So constantly chasing those big external rewards might not be the most effective way to stay motivated over the long term.
Right. Especially when we know there will be setbacks and failures along the way.
Exactly. So what's